everybody has a story, and your story matters to God more than you can imagine, and to you. Nobody gets the story they want. But we also have our stories intersect with other people's stories. They don't merge. Your story will always be your story. Yes. My story will always be my story. But they intersect, and they overlap, and they connect with each other, and our stories are shaped by each other's. And I'm awfully glad that my story intersected with your story.
It did.
And Vance and I are actually leaving on a date for a minute, so we're kind of classing it up. But I was thinking, I think people would love it if you would, whatever you want to say about your story as we're walking through stories together, how do we learn from other people's stories? Folks love to hear that. So
okay.
Anything you want to say?
I'll just dive in and we can interact on it. I wrote a few notes down just so I don't forget anything, but I have loved this series. And honestly, especially the phrase, nobody gets the story they want. Because I think deep inside of us, we're wired to get the story we want. And so that gap, I think, really helps us find God and really dig deep to say, if I don't get the story I want, is there still meaning and purpose there? So a couple of thoughts that I had. The first one was, you have your whole life long to figure out your story. Your story's not static. It's quite dynamic. And I think for me, looking back in the rearview mirror, I tend to learn more about my story when I pause and reflect and look in the rearview mirror rather than in the moment. Sometimes it's not as clear.
Yeah.
So I think for me, when I was a little girl, I was an only child, and my mom and dad both worked. So many good things about my family growing up. In my story, my dad had such a love of the outdoors and bred that in me. My mom worked and was just a delightful social person. But especially for a few years in my early years, maybe from the time I was 3 till 8, and then maybe less so, but still going on, there was a fair amount of fighting in our house going on. And it was, at one point, for me, pretty terrifying. I would, sometimes when they would fight, I would run between them to try to get them to stop fighting. And if that didn't work, I'd run back into the den and turn the TV up louder. And if they were still fighting, I'd leave and try to get them to stop again. And then not infrequently when the fighting escalated to the point of utter frustration, one of them would leave and they would get in the car and go, and the other one might go to bed. And as a little girl, I would sometimes crawl up on the kitchen counter. I can still feel the way that the tile on the kitchen felt on my shins, and I would peer out through the curtains and watch and wait for whoever left to come home. And then when they would pull in the driveway, I would see the lights, and I would run back in bed and pretend to be asleep. And it was tough. And I would often spend time when I would go over to friends' house and look around, like my eyes would dart around, taking it all in and comparing and realizing not all my friends' parents fought like that. And there were a couple of parents who fought worse. But when I was a little girl, it was so terrifying. As I got older, it was anger-producing and frustrating and caused some tension as I tried to work what that all meant out in my life with my mom and me, and had to do a lot of work on that. And then the older I've gotten, been able to put it in the right place to understand they were going through things I certainly couldn't fully understand. And my experience of those years was only a small piece of the whole story. So I think spending your whole life long integrating things into your story, retelling the story, and rethinking what it meant. Yeah.
I was thinking when you were talking about nobody gets the stories they want, and that is somehow supposed to kind of point us towards God.
Yeah.
There's that passage in Romans 8 where Paul talks about, for the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the one that subjected it, that is God, in the hopes that it could be liberated from its bondage to decay, that somehow actually being willing to live in the pain and frustration of not getting the story that I want, can everybody say, oh, there is no story in this world, there is no marriage. I think about what each of our children might say today or at some point about pain points in their story when they were growing up. There is no family there is no job, there is no body that's going to bring the fulfillment that we're all hoping to get. And that idea that somehow there's even something hopeful in that frustration can push me to keep looking and keep looking. And I think that you've done that, I think, in ways that were really kind of remarkable to me, because I don't think I did that nearly as much as a young adult as you did. It caused you to go on a quest for what's a greater story.
And perhaps at some level can make us more compassionate towards the broken pieces of other people's stories, and find common ground there. Another thing, I'm not sure exactly how to put this, but Andy Crouch was out a couple of years ago working with some of our leaders here in the Bay Area, and he talked about going through difficult times and how what God gives you, what he promises, is his presence. And we were in the middle of probably the toughest part of our life, and I just remember muttering under my breath to myself, no one in particular, it's not enough. It's not enough. It's not what I'm looking for. I'm not looking for presence. I'm looking for power. I'm looking for somebody to fix it.
Wow, yeah.
And certainly, when I think of God, I certainly think of somebody who's capable of fixing things. And what I've done with that in my story, especially in the last couple of years, but even throughout my whole life, is I think there's a point for a really important place in our stories for wrestling with God. I think to just mindlessly and chirpily accept things like that does us no service and keeps us living on the surface with God. I think I've said this before, but when I preached on the book of Psalms one time, mathematically, there are more Psalms of lament than there are Psalms of praise. And I wonder sometimes if that means that the way to genuine praise is through lament. And then being able to, over time, absorb the story of Jesus going to the cross, where that's all he got was the presence. And he didn't get the power to change it. But I think to be able to argue with God, to be able to wrestle with God, to be able to not accept things quickly and take time until it percolates down into my soul instead of just on my skin, makes my story more powerful.
Yeah. Remember when I was in school, there was a teacher, Jack Rogers, he would often quote Calvin as saying, when God speaks to us, God lisps. And I think about that sometimes. That's what you do with a baby, because that's how baby talks. That all of us, when we think of God talking, or we say, I imagine God saying something, it always sounds like us. And
So true.
I think for you, God never sounds syrupy, sentimental. There'll just be this feisty, raw, and you meet God there.
Yeah.
And I think that challenges me and a lot of people when they hear you and they think, oh, it's okay for me to get scrappy with God and to think of God getting back that way with me, because each of us has to find our own language and a way to bring our own story into God.
Yeah, and certainly, reading Genesis through Revelation, there are just so many stories like that. And then I think the last thing I would say, if we understand our stories, or as we understand them, that the narrowness of our stories is what allows for a wide life. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, I think, Arthur Miller wrote a book called Why You Can't Be Anything You Want to Be, which I just thought was a brilliant title. You don't even need to read the book, but we keep feeding...
Sorry, Arthur.
We keep feeding our kids and ourselves with this belief. The truth is we have a very narrow range in our DNA. We're sort of preset in our personality, and it informs how we should live our lives and how we meet God. I took my mom, who just moved up to an independent living facility in Santa Barbara last week, 93 years old. And a couple of weeks ago, we went back to the house where I lived my whole life, and it was fun to see the people that live there. We went through the house, and then we drove through the neighborhood, and I saw this place where I used to ride my bike. And when I was 8 years old, I remember being on my bike alone and being absolutely giddy that nobody knew where I was. And last month when I went back there, I think I was 3 blocks from home. It was so much closer than I remember. We used to have a place across the street from our house, about 30 acres of eucalyptus trees, called the Jungle. And all the kids would say, hey, let's meet in the jungle and we'll play all day. And just looking back at who God made me to be, and that need for independence, that need for adventure.
somebody showed us recently an app where you can get it for everybody in the family, and then everybody knows where everybody is. And you were throwing up in your mouth a little bit when you saw it. It's like it's the last thing you want.
No.
Yep.
Do not use that app. People need freedom. But just to say, how will God meet me in who he made me to be? It's so easy, I think, for all of us, but for me to look at other people's stories and wish I had theirs. Yeah. And of course, when I look at 15 different people, I only pick the best parts of their stories. But instead to settle into my story and to find God's presence there and purpose.
That wonderful statement of Dallas Willard, where he says, God has yet to bless anybody except where they actually are.
And if we keep throwing away situation after situation as not being right, we will simply have no place for him to enter our lives. Our dogs are growling and barking, so we probably better go.
I guess
that's our story.
That's right. Too bad, because we had some other really profound things
really
to
profound.
say. But whatever your story is today, just embrace your story, embrace your dog, make it great.
Find God in your story.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss any future teachings from John Ortberg here at Become New. My name's Tim, and I'm a part of the team here. This series is all about stories. Everybody has a story, and everybody's story matters. And we want to know about your story, whether it's a story of coming to faith or a story of spiritual growth. Whatever it is, we're here for you. You can email that to us at connect@becomenew.com, or you can text it to us. You can also sign up for daily reminders whenever we drop a new video via text by texting the word BECOME to the number 855-888-0444. You can also send us prayer requests there. There's a team of us that meet to pray each weekday for viewers just like yourself. If you'd like to receive the emails that go along with each video, be sure to check that out at becomenew.com/subscribe. More than a video to watch, this is really a community to belong to, and we're so glad that you're a part of it. We'll catch you next time.